Mesdames et messieurs, tout d'abord.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very moved, Metin, at your kind words. And you said that good fortune, luck brought me here. And it actually brought me here to Geneva to speak about a very important topic. And I'd like to thank the rector of the university, Professor Vasily. And I'd also like to thank Professor Marc-André Renaud, who holds the UNESCO chair here in international law and the protection of cultural property, which was founded just about a year and a half ago. And of course, thank first and foremost Metin Aditi, my goodwill ambassador for UNESCO, who has helped us in our thinking about tolerance, peace, and dialogue between cultures. So once again, thank you, dear friend, for your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, ambassadors, representatives of the Swiss authorities, it's a real pleasure to be here with you and to have been invited by the University of Geneva, with whom we share so many values. First of all, the value of humanism embodied by Jean Calvin, the founder of the University of Geneva. The values of solidarity inherited from Henri Dunant, founder of the Red Cross, who was also born in Geneva. And finally, the values of peace, which are at the very heart of Swiss history and at the heart of our shared history. I'd like to say that Switzerland plays a central role in UNESCO in this respect through its moral and financial commitment, the commitment of the authorities, businesses, universities, the Swiss Development and Cooperation Agency, in the field of cultural heritage in Mali, Afghanistan, Syria, in the area of water management and the area of education for all. And I am also here to commend the tightening of our relations, the strengthening of relations over the last few years. I'd also like to point out that this year Switzerland holds the presidency of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and this is another very strong sign of international commitment to our shared values. It's difficult to imagine a more fitting place to talk about the subjects that I'd like to touch upon this evening. I'm here to talk to you about peace, about the role of culture in establishing peace and security, and the need to protect culture and heritage in situations of conflict. It's sometimes difficult in the heat of armed conflicts and faced with the horror of humanitarian crises, which often follow these armed conflicts, to talk about culture and heritage. When human lives are at stake, cultural heritage has often and for very long been considered to be a secondary concern. And yet, heritage is now on the front lines of conflicts and new forms of war, which are rife in the 21st century, not only between states, but within societies. We saw this in the 1990s in southeastern Europe, right next to my own country, Bulgaria, in Sarajevo, and following that in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Mali, where cultural heritage was devastated. We're seeing it now in Syria, where the cultural tragedy has been added to the humanitarian emergency, further deepening the wounds and the trauma for Syrian society for a very long time to come. The 6 Syrian sites on the World Heritage List have been destroyed. 4 of them are occupied by military forces, and this is one of them, the Craque des Chevaliers. This is a shot which was taken before the conflict, and this was taken after the conflict. The ancient city of Aleppo has been laid to ruin. On the screen, you can see the city in times of peace, and here is what it looks like today. The minaret of the Grand Mosque has been destroyed. These images, ladies and gentlemen, were shot under conditions of extreme danger, and I would like to pay tribute to the photographers who work for UNESCO in Syria. The fighting in Basra, Damascus, and Palmyra has destroyed or damaged historical monuments many centuries old. The illicit trafficking in cultural property is literally exploding, and it has reached an unprecedented level. It is the result of a deliberate and systematic approach, and as you can see on the screen, the looters have holes in the craters. Apamea and Palmyra are the victims of massive illicit excavations conducted by organized gangs who take advantage of the fragility of societies, launder dirty money, finance terrorism, which is also connected to other forms of trafficking, such as arms and drug trafficking. Some statues were reduced to bits. Frescoes were torn off because they're easier to move and therefore more vulnerable, as you can see in these photos. And this is the first important lesson that I would like to convey today. Heritage is not a collateral victim of a conflict. It is a direct and deliberate target. This is a trend which existed formerly, but which is now on the rise, always based on the same logic and using the same mechanism. In Sarajevo, in Dubrovnik, the warring parties began by burning libraries and by ripping down street signs to hit the enemy hard, erasing their history and their identity. The old bridge at Mostar in Bosnia-Herzegovina was destroyed for the same reasons. It was a footbridge. It had no strategic importance or military importance. It was a bridge where couples in love would meet, and it was destroyed to separate the communities living in the city and to fuel tensions between them. In Afghanistan, the Bamiyan Buddhas were dynamited with the same underlying logic, that is, to cause an escalation in the violence and make it impossible to go back. In Iraq, the Al-Askari Mosque, one of the most beautiful mosques in the world, was also destroyed before being rebuilt with UNESCO's help, and you're seeing some images of that here. In Libya, the Al-Shab al-Damani mausoleum was destroyed with a steam shovel. The Benghazi treasure was stolen in the early days of the conflict, and this is another sign that the criminals wait until societies are fragilized to go after cultural property and loot it far from the reach of cameras. I would like to be very clear from the start. What is at stake here is not just a few monuments and a few old bits of stone. If cultural heritage is targeted, it is because it holds values and identities of societies. And this is the second lesson that I would like to share with you today. Combatants attack heritage to weaken the trust and cohesion between peoples. Once it's destroyed, their collective references also disappear. The destruction of heritage affects societies for a very long time, and prevents them from rebuilding their societies, because culture is what holds them together. It's what holds their identities together and gives them a source of dignity. And this is why the extremists in Mali began by destroying the Timbuktu mausoleums. They also burned and ransacked the manuscripts in Ahmed Baba Library. This was not the result of a spontaneous explosion of popular anger. It was the result of deliberate action aimed at erasing the identity of an entire people, of terrorizing and subjugating a population. This is why it is important to intervene as quickly as possible and to include heritage protection in emergency actions. And it is the inhabitants themselves who request us to do this. The people of Timbuktu themselves hid the manuscripts in cellars, in attics. They smuggled them out at their own risk, at risk to their own lives, to safe places, to Bamako. In a totally different context, in Egypt, the Egyptian people themselves formed a human chain to protect the Egyptian Museum in Cairo during the demonstrations in 2011. And this brings me to the third important lesson. The protection of our heritage has to be part and parcel of emergency operations, and it is indissociable from the protection of human lives, for it carries their values and their identities. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the role and the responsibility of UNESCO. UNESCO was founded just after the Second World War on the conviction, on the premise that economic and political agreements are not enough to build lasting peace, nor are military solutions. Military solutions are not sufficient to establish the rule of law, to build strong institutions, to create trust, which will make it possible to build lasting security. Recent history points up the limits of what political scientists call hard power in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Mali. And military forces themselves remind us of the need to include educational and cultural issues, soft power, in all strategies for peace and lasting security. I'm reminded of the words of Albert Gérard Kounders, special representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations in Mali and head of the United Nations Integrated Stabilization Mission. He said, "Protecting civilians also means protecting their history and their identity. The work to rebuild the mausoleums in Timbuktu is important because these mausoleums are a part of the identity of the city, whose very aim is to protect its inhabitants." The emergence of new forms of war, not just between states, but also within societies, between communities, bring these cultural issues to the forefront. Professor Bertrand Badi from the Political Science School in Paris coined a similar idea during the UNESCO conference on war in the 21st century. Modern war has changed in its very nature. Military victory, when it exists, is only a facade. War is no longer simply a military phenomenon, but a social phenomenon, which presupposes different approaches and responses. It is in this context that the rehabilitation of culture and damaged cultural sites, damaged or destroyed, takes on its full meaning. I saw this in Southeastern Europe, where UNESCO helped, as I already mentioned, to rebuild Mostar Bridge in the beginning of the 2000s after it was destroyed by civil war. The rebuilding of the bridge was done with the veterans of the war, changing this heritage, which had been targeted, into a sign of coming together and a sign of peace. And this is the best response we can give to the extremists. In Afghanistan, UNESCO is involved in work to restore the Bamiyan Valley. We have just signed an agreement with Italy for the restoration of this cultural heritage. It is a project which also embodies international cooperation and has great potential in terms of peace for the entire region, for dialogue between the different cultures and religions. It's a project which calls upon historical ties from the time of the Silk Road. In Mali, UNESCO has just launched, as promised, the reconstruction of the mausoleums. And this is also our response to intolerance. 2 of the 14 destroyed mausoleums have already been rebuilt, and I would like here to thank Switzerland for its contribution of 1 million euros to the rehabilitation of the mausoleums. And I'd like to take this opportunity to especially commend Swiss's commitment in its cultural cooperation with UNESCO, be it in promoting cultural diversity, support to the training of museum professionals, particularly in Egypt last year. And I have to say that the support was decisive in mitigating the effects of the attack on the museum in Cairo in January. And I might also mention Switzerland's commitment to the protection of cultural heritage. You're seeing here the first images of the rebuilt mausoleums, and through them, it's an entire community that is now back on its feet, that can go back to its cultural practices, taking back its ancestral shared heritage. The city of Timbuktu is unique and bears witness to a millennium-old dialogue between cultures and scholars from all Africa, from the Arab world and Al-Andalus, for whom the University of Timbuktu was an intellectual beacon and a place for exchanges as early as the 13th century, followed by a golden age in the 16th century. Mali is the cradle of a veritable African Renaissance and a place which will be very instrumental in renewing dialogue between cultures today. Over 300,000 manuscripts are still held there. It's still one of the largest unexplored cultural treasures of humankind. It's an ocean of books to be discovered to enrich our knowledge about our common history. And I remember, because I went to Timbuktu with the French President, Mr. François Hollande, and the interim president of Mali, Dioncounda Traoré, and I saw the burned manuscripts spread out on the ground in the Ahmed Baba Library. And it was a very emotional moment to see these burned books. It reminded me of the worst hours of humankind's history. I remember this because I was able to speak with the Imam of Timbuktu, who described at length the period of occupation and the exactions that the population endured. And I also saw the Malian people's joy when they were once again able to practice their own culture. This experience, ladies and gentlemen, strengthened once and for all my conviction that restoring heritage is also giving the people the strength and the confidence to look toward the future. It's important for Mali, and above and beyond Mali, because building peace and security today necessarily includes the protection and preservation of culture, heritage, and identities. This experience calls on us to step up our action to ensure that heritage is protected in conflict situations, which are, by their very definition, complex and urgent. I would like to list 3 main areas of action that UNESCO is engaged in. The first area, and this is at the heart of UNESCO's remit, is the consolidation of the legal framework for our interventions. UNESCO has built up a veritable arsenal of treaties and conventions over the last 60 years. There's the Hague Convention of 1954 for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict. We are celebrating the 50th anniversary of this convention this year, and it prohibits the exposure of cultural property to destruction or deterioration by refraining from any act of hostility directed at such property. It's the only international instrument that focuses on the protection of cultural heritage in times of war. Then we have the UNESCO Convention of 1970 on the fight against illicit trafficking of cultural property, which was the first international cultural convention in times of peace, which is in itself quite important. And finally, the Convention of 1972 on cultural and natural world heritage.
These conventions bear witness to the duty of the states to protect heritage and to be accountable for this heritage. These texts evolve over time and adapt to changes due to modern conflicts. For instance, after the wars in southeastern Europe in the 90s, where destroying the heritage was in fact a weapon of war and destabilization, the 1954 convention was strengthened by the adoption of a second protocol and the setting up of a special follow-up committee. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Mrs. Fatou Bensouda, also decided to consider attacks against Malian culture as war crimes, and I would like to quote her on this. In January 2013, the International Court of Justice decided to open an investigation in Mali because it deemed that the intentional and deliberate destruction of cultural and religious heritage in Mali is a war crime according to the Rome Statutes. UNESCO is an essential partner in our quest for justice, end of quote. Already in 2001, the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia had listed the destruction of heritage as a charge in the proceedings about the attack of the port of Dubrovnik in Croatia in 1991. This is a positive sign, but nevertheless, we haven't got enough means to deal with these problems given the size of the challenges. The conventions are not ratified by enough states. The political will is lacking and we don't have the necessary means. Out of the 5 members of the Security Council of the United Nations, only 4 have ratified the Hague Convention. Less than half the European states and less than a quarter of African states have ratified or adhered to the convention. There are too many states that have not adopted the necessary and adequate criminal legislation in their national legislation to enforce these conventions. And there are too many states that have yet to adopt safeguard measures in times of peace, which are essential if we are to prevent destruction. And that is the second main area of action. We need to inform, to educate, to raise the awareness of officials, authorities, and citizens as to the importance and the need to protect heritage. As soon as there's a risk of illicit trafficking, UNESCO immediately alerts neighboring countries and its partners, in particular Interpol and the World Customs Organization, so as to strengthen border controls with the neighboring countries, to alert the auction houses and art dealers, asking them to check very carefully the provenance of these objects. From the very beginning of the conflicts that broke out in Mali and Syria, the sites of the World Heritage were listed as endangered so as to enhance people's vigilance and to make it easier for calls for funding and to give further weight, political weight, to operations which have been developed to support and control. So UNESCO therefore acted for that. The Security Council recognized and acknowledged the importance of culture in the conflict in Mali in 3 resolutions passed in 2012 and 2013. And we did the same for Syria. The resolution adopted on February 22nd implicitly and explicitly acknowledges the importance of protection of Syrian heritage. This is an important sign. I drafted a joint declaration with the Secretary General of the United Nations and the UN Special Envoy and the Arab League to call on the people to cease these destructions. These stances enable us to put pressure and integrate the protection of heritage in peacekeeping operations and negotiations, allowing us to deal with the crisis. The third main area of action is direct intervention in the field, despite conventions, despite appeals. Very often, more often than not, soldiers and humanitarian personnel are not familiar with the texts that have been ratified by their countries. They need to be properly informed and educated. In Mali, UNESCO has supplied all military commands and chiefs of staff with maps and disseminated more than 8,000 heritage passports to inform soldiers and humanitarian agents of the existence of these sites and the need to protect these. You see this passport, this heritage passport, you see one on the screen, and I've brought one with me. We, on a regular basis, organise training workshops for culture professionals, customs officials, to help them coordinate their actions. In 2012, during the Mali crisis, we organised a training workshop in Dakar. The number of officials, customs officials and police officers took part in this workshop, and then we organised a second one in Bamako in April 2013 as part of the action plan to save the Mali heritage. UNESCO has launched a special fund. $300,000 have been set aside to protect cultural heritage and to fight illicit trafficking. More than 10 million are necessary to rebuild the mausoleums. A joint action plan has been set up. It's essential because we won't be able to do lasting work if we do not work with all the involved partners. To rise to the challenge of the crisis in Syria, we held a workshop in Amman in Jordan in February 2013, a seminar on the illicit trafficking of cultural heritage, which allowed us to identify the role of stakeholders and to develop an integrated action plan. We've also developed an international observatory of Syrian cultural heritage to raise the awareness of scientists and professionals and to find a post-action plan with the support of the European Union and a fund amounting to 2.5 million euros, which we have developed from our office in Beirut and within Syria, because obviously we need to work with people that are in Syria. We need to rebuild, to rehabilitate, to conduct inventories. It's a lot of work. And we are not as naive as to believe that it's not because we've rebuilt a bridge in Mostar or a mausoleum in Timbuktu that we'll be able to restore peace and dialogue. It is a very complex process. But these constructions physically represent this possibility of dialogue, and that's what's important to our mind, at least. They show, these constructions, that we have a certain vision of culture and that we can use culture in our multicultural societies for the bettering of the society as a whole. And I would like to emphasize how important this aspect is in the last part of my speech, and talk about the role of culture and heritage as a tool of dialogue and social cohesion, mediation, to prevent conflicts. This is very important in frail societies under tension, where we organize workshops to encourage this culture for peace, where we need to find a common language to encourage the dialogue between communities, cultures and religions, and especially amongst young people. This is particularly true in societies of developed countries that are going through crises, uncertainty, and suffer their own tensions, conflicting identities, and wounded memories. Heritage can play a very important role, including intangible heritage could also play a very important role. We need to enhance the value of these identities and make room for this feeling of dignity and mutual respect. I'd just like to mention the example of the Saman dance in Indonesia, which is practiced by a minority of the Aceh province in Sumatra. They suffered a terrible earthquake and tsunami. The acknowledgement of this dance, the UNESCO listed intangible heritage, has played a very important role to strengthen social cohesion and to encourage the dialogue between various parts of society, and their relations were relatively complicated. And in all the histories of conflicts and mass violence and genocide, like in Rwanda 20 years ago, there are warning signs that are there. There are professions of hatred, declarations of hatred that are disseminated by the media, which stigmatize the other and make the other's heritage look ridiculous. In a world where images and information circulate increasingly rapidly, and there are words that are hurtful and there are words that are deadly, and a simple spark can lead to a tremendous fire breaking out. We need to be aware of this and reinforce our intercultural skills and competences more than ever, so as to better understand the cultures of others and the relations between these cultures and develop peace. We want to be citizens of the world today, and therefore we need to speak this language of cultural diversity. Extremists that are out to harm heritage want to lock culture in its restrictive vision, in exclusive vision. That's what the extremists in Mali had said after the destruction of mausoleums. They said, world heritage doesn't exist, simply doesn't exist. The infidels should stay out of our business. And after all, what's UNESCO all about? These statements are the representation of a compartmentalized world of different cultures where it is impossible to engage in dialogue, and we are against this view. We stand for a totally different vision. As far as UNESCO is concerned, civilizations are not static or frozen entities. They are dynamic and they evolve permanently. Our cultures are not isolated one from the other. They are inclusive and linked to one another. This is the tremendous challenge for the globalized world. I was in Pakistan recently, last month, in fact. I went to the site of Taxila. It's to the north of Islamabad, and it's listed in the World Heritage. There's a museum just around the corner from the site. You can see a photo, and you see there are Buddhas. And look at their hair. It looks very Greek, and it is Greek in origin. This goes back to the time of the generals of Alexander the Great, who had settled in the region. And this is what led to the development of the Greek and Roman culture. This blending of cultures just show that a pure culture just doesn't exist. Cultures influence one another, interact with one another, sometimes peacefully, sometimes painfully. But no culture can develop in isolation. In Iran, the Armenian monasteries that are listed in the World Heritage are full of influences from the Orthodox world, the Persian world, the Byzantine world. In Tanzania, Zanzibar, which is a stone city, is a melting pot of African, Arab, Indian and European cultures. The first Renaissance in France, that of the 12th century, is in fact due to the rediscovery of Aristotle thanks to the Archbishop of Toledo that had seen to it that his work was translated. And Corneille draws on Spanish Baroque theatre to write his plays. And Louis XIV was passionate about Chinese porcelain, Chinese lacquerwork, and Chinese silk. The president of China, Mr. Xi Jinping, was in UNESCO last month to remind us that medicine tea circulated along the Silk Road right up to Europe, and how astronomy, mathematics, and geography took the same Silk Road back to China and influenced China. This idea of the clash of civilizations is fed by the ignorance of these links which existed between cultures, and we need to remind ourselves of this importance. During the World Cultural Forum of UNESCO in Bali, the great philosopher, the Indian philosopher Amartya Sen, reminded the audience of the University of Nalanda in India. It's the oldest university in the world. It was founded in the 5th century, well before Bologna, Oxford or Cambridge. You can see the ruins of the university on the screen. At its peak, the university had 10,000 students and 2,000 professors. And it is said that the library had so many books that when it burnt down for 3 months. This university had students from all over Asia, from Sumatra, China, Korea, Japan, which just goes to show that university international networks already existed in those times. And this is why Amartya Sen said, and I quote, "Given the importance of the plurality of our identities, the different ways in which peoples and cultures have worked together throughout history deserves special and renewed attention." It is the study of these interactions that is essential to avoid hiding culture behind these walls. These complex or old interactions tend to be forgotten or hidden by those who want to stir up hatred between peoples, and they don't always find their enlightened opponent able to refute their false allegations. That's why the history of our connected humankind should be taught at school. And this idea is in keeping with that of the World Heritage born more than 40 years ago at UNESCO, which remains revolutionary even today. Some of these sites have an exceptional universal value. We understand this instinctively when, as tourists, we visit the pyramids of Egypt, Machu Picchu, and here in Sangol, the St. Gall Abbey, or the Rician Railway, also listed in the World Heritage List of UNESCO. Culture gives us access to the highest human aspirations. It reminds us of what brings us together, which is much stronger than what divides us. And we feel this when we watch television pictures of destroyed or vandalized temples. The whole world is outraged. And this feeling tells a lot about us, and it tells a lot about the link that binds us together. Each culture is an access to what is universal. We need culture, all cultures, to be real human beings. Heritage is an open book as to the connections between cultures, and it's a tool to encourage dialogue and peace, which need to be shared with as many people as possible. For example, the prehistoric cities which were built on silts, situated around the Alps, which are listed in the World Heritage List, jointly by Switzerland and 5 other countries. It's a whole network within the heart of Europe. Globalization, ladies and gentlemen, offers a lesson to us all in terms of diversity and suggests that we develop this network of intelligence which leads us to bring together the variety of our cultures which enrich us and the links that bring us together, our common values, our shared values and human rights. This is not easy because when we talk about identity and culture, people are very sensitive and this may lead to tension. It's a very complex exercise, all the more so that in traditions we tend to go for sharp breaks and identities which are very clear. This language, nevertheless, is indispensable today if we are to continue engaging in this dialogue and building and maintaining peace between states and within our society, which are increasingly diverse with all sorts of identities and complex affiliations. The traces of these relations from one culture to another are sometimes buried in the history of societies when we need to be curious and remain curious to bring them to the fore. And that is why UNESCO strongly encourages the listing of cultural and natural sites which cross borders so that the countries decide together to protect a shared heritage. And I think this is what is the future of the Convention of the World Heritage. And this is what we implement on a daily basis by organizing workshops for the culture of peace, like in Africa, where we use heritage as a tool for dialogue and mutual respect, because that's where the remit of UNESCO becomes meaningful. It's a very complex type of work, which is similar to the very patient work that Metin Arditi mentions in the Confrérie des Moines Volants, which I suggest that you read. He's given me a copy, a signed copy, not so long ago. And I strongly recommend that you read this book. It's the work of the Venerable Nicodemus, helped with a handful of beggar monks who decided in the 30s to save the treasures of sacred Orthodox art which were looted by the Soviet regime. These treasures are going to remain hidden over several decades, unseen. And it's a very strong image because in each culture there are hidden treasures, paths that lead us to one another. And for all sorts of reasons, these paths are forgotten and lost. And if we can recreate them one day, they help us to enrich one another and bring us closer to one another. This is a perpetual movement, and in the emergency of conflict, it's difficult to set it, too late to set it in motion. That's why we have to set it in motion beforehand and to find in each and every culture these hidden links which link us all and which at the same time highlight everything that is unique. And to do that, we need to protect heritage. And therefore, we need to encourage research and the recording of all the sites. We need to develop international law and rules of protection of international heritage as we do in UNESCO. This is the commitment of Professor Marc-André Renaud, and I would like also to call on all students and young people who are here in this room and who tomorrow will be those with the responsibilities in Switzerland and Europe and elsewhere. Don't forget how important heritage is. Protect it, use it as a pillar and a resource for dialogue, for creativity, and finally for peace. Thank you for listening.
Madam Director General, you've just given us a very impressive presentation, very rich, a lot of optimism, a lot of dark words, but also hope. You talked about the normative work of UNESCO, the work on rehabilitating heritage, not only through UNESCO, but also with the help of the populations, and also your work in training and education. Your conclusion, I think, carries a message of hope. We here at the University of Geneva and the UNESCO chair take this message very seriously. Why? Because we are teaching students. You mentioned them in your conclusion. Students who are the future of our countries, and to whom we give teaching in law, but also art and archaeology. These students receive this teaching, but they also give a lot. And we feel that we receive a lot from our students. Why do I say this? Because they ask some very germane questions. I hope that they're not going to disappoint me tonight. They're interested in new fields, new areas, and increasingly they are very open-minded to the rest of the world. So now it is to them that I would like to give the floor now. I'd like to ask you to ask any questions that you might like to put to Madame Bokova. And since it's always difficult to ask the first question, I will do that. Madam Director General, you spoke about the Taxila Museum. What do you think is the importance of the museum community in applying UNESCO conventions? Do you think that museums can play a specific role in this work? Well, I thought that since the chair of UNESCO was here, the first question would be an easy one, but thank you anyway for asking it. It's a very interesting question because I think that there's a renewed interest in museums. There was a period during which we were interested in digital communication, the internet, and there was this idea that museums were perhaps obsolete. But there's a very lively debate in UNESCO now about what museums really represent. There's an idea about a new convention and a debate as to whether that new convention a new legal instrument should be drafted on museums. But the most important thing, I think, is that museums today have really become a place of teaching and learning, a place for teaching and learning. And in my opinion, we haven't used museums enough in many regions of the world. We all know that museums are sometimes considered as being elitist, but opening them up, making them more democratic, using them for teaching is always a challenge for many countries. You mentioned Taxila, which is a very interesting museum. I visited it with the Pakistani Minister of Education and Culture. And in the museum, you can clearly see the different periods of civilization and culture, from prehistory to the Greek period, the Persian period, the arrival of Islam, etc. And you can literally see this in the museum. And the museum is really a blend of all these cultures. In talking to the minister, I said, you should make more use of the museum for educational purposes. You don't have a big educational program, and we're going to help Pakistan now because there really is a desire to use the museum and its material as a tool for reconciliation and multicultural education. That's just one example, but this is going on everywhere in museums. In some large emerging countries, in China, for example, 2,000 museums are being built. Without culture, without an approach to not necessarily to culture, because some of these are modern museums. But without this, there's no way of achieving social cohesion. This is why it's very important for us that culture is being recognized as an integral part of sustainable development. Sustainable development is the big topic for the United Nations, the post-2015 agenda, development agenda, and all of that. But you cannot have sustainability in development if you don't recognize cultures, not as its central aim, obviously, but culture as a tool, as an instrument. And museums are one prong of this, or one part of it, but not only through their exhibitions, but also through their teaching potential. Thank you very much, madam. So that was the first question. Now I'm looking out to the audience, and I'm sure that there are many other people. I see two people in the back who look like students. Not students. That's all right. You can still ask your question. But you need a microphone. Just please wait for it.
Alors, tout à l'heure, vous avez dit...
Earlier, you said that rebuilding a heritage was indissociable from social rehabilitation and reconstruction and economic reconstruction in a post-war situation. NGOs always play an important role in reconstruction after a war in a country. So how can NGOs be made aware of the importance of cultural heritage? I've often asked NGOs what they're doing in countries like Haiti or other countries. What are you doing in the cultural field? So what is the role of the NGOs? And they usually say nothing, says the speaker asking the question. Well, you know, NGOs have a role. They're huge international NGOs, and then there are large international associations. Where's Julia? Julia Martin-Lefebvre, the Director General of IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. We work with ICOMOS also. We work with the International Council of Museums, the Holy See. It's a very important institution. We have launched the red list for Syrian cultural heritage in the Metropolitan Museum last year. So their role is very important. And I think that NGOs should play a very important role. I wish there were more NGOs working in the area of protection of cultural heritage. I would like to encourage them. I would like to invite them to work with us, especially when there are humanitarian situations. I went to Haiti twice. My last trip was very recent. It was just a few months ago, and I wanted to see what was happening in terms of rebuilding the citadel, which was also damaged. Not heavily damaged, not seriously damaged, but damaged by the earthquake. And in Haiti, we work with a lot of NGOs on craftsmanship, on intangible heritage, but it's not enough. So it is important. There are a lot of specialists and experts who can help us with this work. Thank you very much. I see a question over there, the lady in the second row. Good evening, madam. Thank you for all of the hard work you're doing with UNESCO. It was very interesting to me that you mentioned the intangible heritage, the Sabah dance in Indonesia. It is a shame that you couldn't develop that a little bit and talk about violence against women, forced marriage, genital mutilation. Perhaps I could just say a couple of words. Why not work on these barbarian practices, which are cultural rituals. That's a very, very broad field. It's a shame. I'd like to know what you think about it, because we have an NGO that wanted to protect female initiation rituals under UNESCO. There are 154 countries that practice excision or genital mutilation. Why doesn't UNESCO look into this? Look into these barbaric cultural rituals. Nobody wants to talk about them, especially because that's such an intimate part of the woman that's affected. Well, we're very interested in this. UNESCO and I personally work with other UN agencies who are combating female genital mutilation. I recently went to New York for the Committee on the Status of Women. Madame Chaka Kampare, the First Lady of Burkina Faso, is a militant. She's a good friend of mine, and she's fighting this as well. UNESCO does not consider this to be intangible heritage. Let me state that quite clearly. We have a convention on intangible heritage which lays down some very clear criteria for assessing what is and what is not intangible cultural heritage. Let me also remind you that in 2003, UNESCO adopted a declaration on cultural diversity. And something very important here, which is that cultural diversity cannot damage or impinge on human rights. And I think that's quite clear. We in no way consider that these barbaric rituals are part of our intangible heritage. What we are talking about are traditions which are not connected to ancient but barbaric practices that go against human rights. We established a UNESCO chair at Nairobi University in Kenya, which is working on education on female genital mutilation, because it's always good to approach a problem from all angles if you want to use education as a preventive tool. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we have a center for the Great Lakes region. It's a documentation center, and it conducts research on women's issues, and we're doing a major job of work there on this as well. So we're very involved with other agencies that are working on these barbaric practices.
Droit devant.
Thank you. There's a question straight ahead. Yes, sir.
Le monsieur qui lève la main.
Gentleman who just raised his hand, if you could bring a microphone down to him.
C'est éblouissant, hein?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. It's difficult to see you out there because of the lighting. Thank you, madam, for this presentation. I realize that culture is an indicator of development, and it's therefore one of the Millennium Development Goals. You talked about the regional office in Beirut and the new funding. What about the new UNESCO centers that have opened up? Are they as active as other international organizations in Africa, Middle East, and the Far East? My question is to do with the future of the International Center in Algiers of the intangible heritage of Africa. So your question is to do with the importance of regional centers, if I understood you correctly. Yes. And the way in which the African Center for Intangible Heritage works. you signed in February an agreement. Yes, we set up a center in Algiers, you're right. As you know, we have more than 60 regional centers. There are national centers under the aegis of UNESCO, and the centers that protect cultural heritage, intangible heritage, also deal with water management, education. This is all part of our remit. So we signed with the Minister of Culture, the Algerian Minister of Culture, this agreement. It's not a new idea. This is something that was discussed already 2 years ago, and we approved 2 years ago the setting up of such centers. It's very important because it's the first center with that remit of that size in Africa and the Arab world in Africa, but not only the Arab world in Africa. We know that intangible heritage plays a very important role, and how important it is to train agents and representatives, how to conduct inventories, etc., and how to develop protection measures. So we are counting a great deal on the center in Algiers, and we're going to develop the network even further. We have a whole network of such centers in Latin America, in Peru, in Cusco. We have 3 in Asia, in Korea, in Japan, in China, 1 in Bulgaria for most of Europe. And this was the first time that these centers, these regional centers, came together in Bulgaria to try and coordinate their activities so as to how to accompany UNESCO, so as to give more life to your convention, if I understood your question correctly. There's another question at the front of the room here, Mrs. McFella.
Devant, plus.
Right at the front, right down at the front, Mrs. McFella. Unfortunately, the microphone is not switched on or not working.
Vous devez vous exprimer.
Ça marche? Oui. Alors tout d'abord, Madame la Directrice Générale.
I'd like to start off by thanking you, Madam, for this very interesting presentation, which ends on an optimistic note, which obviously is a great deal of comfort to all those who work in the field of culture. Nevertheless, I'd like to put a question to do with the end result, the final result of UNESCO's work. You talked about vandalism, and we could also talk about iconoclasts. I'd like to put the following question. All the legislative and normative apparatus that you have set up has had a positive effect or not? Because some researchers and critics claim that UNESCO gives visibility to these sites, and this transformed them into targets. Some researchers have said that the mausoleums in Mali and the Buddhas of Bamiyan wouldn't have been destroyed if the targets, if they hadn't been identified as important in terms of international value, and therefore then became targets for the warring factions. That's a very provocative question, yes, but at the same time I can understand the reason why it is put. I remember a meeting in 2012 in St. Petersburg. The committee met, and the 5 sites in Syria were added to the list of the of World Heritage, and we were wondering whether this would endanger them further and make them convenient targets. But we decided nevertheless to list them because we do not give in to extremists or who believe it's not important to protect World Heritage. This being said, if I may, you started off your question by asking whether there are positive results that have been achieved thanks to our work and operations. Of course, I'm absolutely convinced that the answer is yes in reply to your question, because if you look to the Convention of World Heritage, today we're used to this. I mean, as if this convention had always existed, as if the World Heritage lists had always existed, but it's not the case. I mean, once the sites are listed, the mindsets change radically. And it's not only a matter of physically protecting the site, preserving the site, which is very important, of course, but what's also very important is the fact that this site then becomes shared and this value becomes shared by everyone. And this is what we are talking about. We're talking about Mali here in Geneva. We're talking about Syria here in Geneva. I think this is quite extraordinary, what has come about in the world, because everybody is interested when somebody is under attack. And this is something relatively new, this awareness to do with culture and heritage. And also another very important aspect is this message of culture and dialogue, which we are trying to bring across, that there is no single pure, in inverted commas, culture. That's such a culture does not exist. There is no such thing as a pure, in inverted commas, culture, like the example of the Buddhas with the hair, which is identical to the hair you find on Greek statues. Now, this is not only down to UNESCO, but it's also down to this universal framework of states and governments who are doing their best for this to be possible. And I can't simply forget other activities. I mean, increasingly we talk about the need to strengthen the 1970 Convention against the illicit trafficking of cultural property and cultural goods. And here again, we have been successful. We've had positive feedback, and we've had cultural property which has been restored to states, although they haven't signed bilateral agreements to do so, simply on the basis of this convention. And we've worked very hard to raise the awareness, to encourage international cooperation in these matters. And there's again a lot of cultural goods have been returned or have been the object of illicit trafficking. You talked about Cambodia. Yes, last year the committee of the listed World Heritage in Cambodia, the Metropolitan Museum in New York, based on this convention with the help of UNESCO, we accompanied the return of 12 Angkor warrior statues back to Cambodia, and it was a very, very moving event which took place. So I'm not saying that this is the only positive feedback, but it's become increasingly the case, and we are trying and helping this movement. Well, Madame Bokova, on this very positive note, we shall end the evening, but I would like to thank you, Madam, for having shared with us these ideas and words, and I know your time is very precious, so I'd like to thank you on behalf of the University. Thank you.
Ne partez pas. Et s'agissant de vous remercier, je souhaite...
And as a token of our appreciation, I'd like to give you these two mementos. The first one is a tiny, tiny little book, a booklet in red moleskin, which we had created 2 years ago when you created the chair, and Mr. van der Inn, the director for culture had called the Little Red Book. So here's a copy of this Little Red Book as a token of our appreciation. And our second token of appreciation is not a book to do with the university nor the chair of UNESCO. It's a brochure which has been published by the Chancellery of the Republican Canton of Geneva to do with the arbitration of the Alabama, which is at the very basis of the resolution of the peaceful resolution of conflict which took place in 1872 in Geneva. And it is the beginning of a long process of peaceful resolution of conflicts. And I think that Geneva is a place where we believe in this time-honored tradition, and we hope that this time-honored tradition will continue when it comes to the peaceful resolution of conflict to do with cultural heritage, and this is what we are working on here at the University of Geneva and at the chair of UNESCO. So again, a token of our appreciation, and thank you very much.